Welcome to the NomNom.com podcast. I'm your host, Nom Nom. Today we're going to talk about how you don't make friends with factoids, how what feels true often becomes true, and the idea of ethical storytelling. Let's get into it. Earlier this month, the Academy of Interactive and Visual Arts honored the story What Famine Feels Like by Dalmar Einash and Hilal Sobhan with a Communicator Award for General Excellence in Feature Writing. The piece is a first-person narrative in which Dalmar traces his journey from surviving famine as a child in the 1970s Somalia to his current work as a hunger expert at CARE. So what? Why tell you about this? First, I think it's good. You should read it if you haven't already. But also, I think it serves as a useful example of what an ethical storytelling culture can produce. A little background for you. CARE is a worldwide humanitarian relief organization with operations in more than 100 countries. The marketing team supports this work with content, features, photo essays, short films, social posts, etc., that shows how CARE's impact plays out in people's lives. I find this kind of work fulfilling because I believe stories are a basic human need. People use stories to form social connections, take agency over their lives, and to make meaning out of trauma. I also believe people use luminous images, the lacunae between utterances and networked sounds, to do those same things. But for our purposes here, we'll stick with stories. For the less woo-woo, more data-driven among us, stories are also motivation. People are 20 times more likely to remember facts if those facts are part of a story, and people are more likely to act if they think their actions will affect a story's outcome. The CARE marketing team's ethical storytelling culture was built by the practice of the writers, filmmakers, photographers, and content creators who consciously prioritize the lived experiences of the people they work with. The idea is to not report on people in crises, but to create stories with them. The team works to center the voices of communities often sidelined in the rush to report facts. The goal is to co-create public narratives with those most affected and to help those stories reach audiences ready to help. So, okay, flashback to early 2024. On a global staff call, Dalmar said the United Nations was considering formally declaring a famine in Gaza. But, he added, these official declarations often come after the best opportunities to intervene. Then, he said, almost offhand, that he knew from experience, growing up in Somalia in the 70s. I know, he said, what famine feels like. Then he moved on. Mary Kate Wilson, CARE's director of content and creative, didn't move on though. She asked the CARE news team to pursue what Dalmar was hinting at. I had been working on a number of first-person projects around that same time, including a collective telling of how communities celebrated Ramadan in the shadow of the war in Gaza, and an oral history of Greenpeace hanging a giant resist banner over the first Trump White House. I'd also been exploring how to turn the glut of interview transcripts we had coming in from country offices into first-person narratives, rather than just lifting quotes for press releases or extracting biographical information for photo captions. I've been inspired by Eli Saslow's work at the Washington Post and the New York Times, particularly how he shaped interviews from the COVID-19 pandemic and other crises into compelling, emotionally resonant narratives that kept the speaker's distinct voices intact. With all that in mind, the team, Reed Davis, Hilal, and me, worked together to develop a set of questions for Hilal to ask Dalmar over Zoom. The final transcript of that Zoom call was long, so to 14 pages, if I remember right. and it was clear from the first read how personal and at times painful it was for Dalmar. He hadn't told many of these stories before, and it clearly took great courage and trust for him to be so open with a colleague over Zoom. The result wasn't a linear story with a neat beginning, middle, and end. It was something less obvious, more honest. I organized the transcript by theme and timeline using scissors and highlighters, then reassembled sections, read them, reshaped them with a glue stick, and then started over again until the structure held, without compromising Dalmar's voice. Hillel and Reed then worked with CARE's Somali team to fact-check and add historical context. After all that, we brought a draft back to Dalmar, making it clear he could revise, reject, or tell us to start over if he felt like it. He graciously clarified terms and expanded some parts, though he admitted reading it was painful. Still, he gave his blessing to move ahead, so we moved into the final stage, where Mary Kate helped shape the narrative, and the country director gave final approval for publication. From start to finish, the process took about 4 months. By then, the Gaza famine had faded from global headlines, and Care News itself had published roughly 20 other pieces about the war, focusing on what it's like to get your period in Gaza, to deliver babies, to get medical supplies, to find shelter, and to have a child contract polio, and more. The immediate spark for the story had passed, but we believed we had something rare. Not just a compelling narrative, but something with real emotional depth. Instead of extracting a quote or a single illustrative visual for a prefab dispatch, we had built a structure together where Dalmar's experience had room to live more fully on its own terms. With the words fixed, we now just had to figure out the visuals. We didn't want to make the piece feel like just one more disaster post in readers' feeds, or some kind of daily crisis tourism that would erase the proximity we'd managed to achieve through the narrative. Because the story navigated personal memory and historical trauma, we didn't think documentary photographs would hit the right note. We'd published powerful illustrated work from Melissa Cornet in Afghanistan before, and we used that piece as a model to brainstorm with the social and design teams different approaches that might have a similar feel. We'd also been testing different AI tools, and so we mocked up some ideas using various text-to-image generators. CARE's creative director, Simon Duncan Watt, used Midjourney to create torn paper-style illustrations that added emotional depth without sensationalizing. As a team, we felt like those were weirdly just right. Dalmar agreed. It was more human than human, I guess, though the question of whether or not it's ethical to use an inhuman intelligence to illustrate a human story is a whole separate podcast. When the story finally went live, it stood out. It was long form. It was visual. It wasn't tied to a news peg or a particular campaign moment. It stood on its own, but it was still deeply tied to Dalmar's work and to the broader why behind CARE's mission. We didn't submit it for a Pulitzer or even a National Magazine Award, but we were psyched to learn it was rightly honored for excellence alongside Netflix, the Getty Museum, NASA, and Masterclass. Okay, so now what? What Famine Feels Like modeled CARE's ongoing shift from reporting on someone to building a narrative with them. Many humanitarian stories either flatten or sensationalize. They rush to make a point, often at someone else's expense. This one didn't. Instead, it slowed down. It centered one voice. It wasn't simply about giving someone a platform, here's the WordPress login, good luck, but about using the skills we had at CARE to help Dalmar craft a story that our audiences would feel in their guts. We worked from the belief that we had a care audience, that we knew how to reach them, and that we could use our tools to shape a first-person story that didn't rely on what can feel like any of the hackneyed NGO story tropes. Things are bad. NGO arrives. Things are good. This story wasn't about making someone the face of a crisis. It was about voice, agency, trust. I know most organizations won't have the freedom to do something like this. Not because they don't care, but because it's hard. It takes time, coordination, and consent. It takes a lot of revision, ego checks, and recentering. But it is possible, and I think it is a better way to do things. Working to develop an ethical storytelling culture that empowers the co-creation of stories and distribution instead of perpetuating extraction and dependence makes for work that can actually change and maybe even save lives.